All right, we got lots of people pouring in here.
Good morning, everybody.
All right, all right. Do we have Jenny? Is she in here?
She should be. I just saw her. It looks like she got bumped out. I'm going to go retrieve her.
All right. Well, while we're waiting for our speaker to make her way here, I just want to officially welcome everybody to the 2022 Future Harvest Conference with the overarching theme, Together We Can. So hopefully everyone's had a good start to the 2022 season already, and you're certainly in the right place to get started. My name is Thelonious Cook, and I am not your speaker. I'm just the host for today. And while we're waiting, I will go over some quick, housekeeping notes. By now, you might have had opportunity to navigate around the social platform as you started to peruse around the agenda and set your own agenda. There is a tab for announcements that we will be making throughout the day, so just be mindful of that. There's also a tab for the photo contest. So if you guys have a photo that you would like to submit, and the description is there for what, actually the description is in the announcements of what the qualifications that we're asking for. So whether you have a photo that you would like to submit, or you just want to vote on photos that have already been submitted, certainly make sure you do that throughout the day. Amy Rose, do we have Jenny yet?
She is in the room.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I am going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. You guys are on mute right now, but if you do have questions, we do have staff monitoring the chat. By now, I think most of you have are pretty aware how to navigate Zoom, but just in case, don't want to exclude anyone. If you look towards the bottom of your screen, there's a chat option which you can type questions, and we'll be monitoring that and try our best to get that, to the speaker. There's also, if you look to the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you can mute and unmute yourself. And it's good that we see most of you already. I know that's helpful for the speaker to be able to see faces and get those sort of nonverbal cues. And without further ado, I will introduce our speaker, Jennifer Glenister from New Morning Farm. She is the operator at New Morning Farm, which is a 50-year diversified organic vegetable farm serving markets in Washington, D.C. It's managed by a team of 10 growers and an apprentice. And it's a 25-acre organic vegetable production. They currently do 4 farmers markets. Jenny is now in her 13th season after having started an apprenticeship in 2009. She grew up on a family farm in New York's Finger Lakes region and came to New Moon Farm from the University of Vermont with a biology degree. Snap peas are her most favorite crop, but as a farm operator, she oversees everything from business and planning to soil health and production of crops, all the way through the marketing. Jenny can be found at weekend markets, and when she's not growing vegetables or running a business, Jenny spends time cooking, horseback riding, playing music, being out in the fields and forests, and she's slowly finishing a tiny house. So without further ado, Jenny, take it away.
Hey, Jenny, you're muted.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everyone here and to feel this lovely group of folks, even though we're spread out and virtual. I did ask a few questions in the chat if you are interested. Curious to hear and share where you're from, and then also maybe what pest, weed, or disease is really frustrating or worrying to you, and a challenge, and what is a crop or area where you just feel like you have lots of opportunity for improvement. It's kind of fun to hear what other folks are struggling with, and then we all have been there too. And so that's a great thing. Is everyone hearing me okay? Everything working great? Great. And everyone sees the screen nicely? Wonderful. Thank you. If you do have questions as I go along, please don't hesitate to type them in the chat. If we don't get to them in the middle, I really hope we have a nice time at the end to just share stories and challenges. Great. So let me see if I can make this work here. Sharing my screen. There we go. Okay. So New Morning Farm, we had a really nice introduction there. Thank you. We do about 26 acres now of diverse certified organic vegetables. Everything we do on the farm is focused at our retail farmers markets in Washington, D.C. So we do a tiny bit of wholesale, but that's really not the focus and the goal. We are a year-round farm now. We go to markets from May through March, and resale, collaborating with our neighbor producers, and connecting those producers to our customers in DC is a huge part of what keeps our farm resilient financially, but also lets us serve our customers really well. So we collaborate on tree fruit, both organic and conventional, and cheeses and breads and baked goods. And that's just a wonderful branch of the farm that keeps us going. We also kind of produce vegetable growers, we hope. We have an apprentice program where our apprentices are managing the farm right from the beginning. So our goal is really reliable, sufficient, high quality variety at market each week for our customers. So we do this in a couple of ways. We do lots of succession plantings. So an example, we do 21 plantings of green beans every year. And we do probably over 30 plantings of lettuce in a year. And so very quickly, with over 40 crops, it gets very complex. And that's where our management team, our apprentices, come in. We have to have that team in order to keep this thing under control even a little bit. And then also season extension at the beginning of the season and at the end of the season. And we use high tunnels right through the winter. We were harvesting beautiful lettuce on Monday, just from a high tunnel grown in soil. So a little bit about our management approach. We try to keep a super proactive attitude. So whenever we make an observation, our first question is, what can we do? What are we going to try? And then the next question is, okay, should we do this? Like, is this just putting way too much effort into this thing? We really actually have to spend some of this effort somewhere else. But we will do and try just about anything in order to have those reliable harvests. We also, day to day, week to week, we have this group working together, this management team. So we observe, we plan, we make an adjustment to the plan when we observe something else, we do, and then we evaluate. And then you cycle that back into the beginning. This is not easy. It really is hard to especially get that evaluation kind of recorded, even roughly, in a way that it's useful to us the next time around. So it's a cycle, and this is also, there's a balance. We are not perfect at this, but it tends to be a good thing to try to fall back on. So as we think about challenges here, record keeping is really important with so many crops, and also folks coming in and going out. We bring in apprentices, we get them trained up, and then we have to try to extract the experience that we've just put into them and hold some of it here, even as we send it off into the world. So record keeping is super critical for remembering lessons learned, or lessons that you think you've learned, or questions. We don't know why this happened, but I wonder if it was this. I wonder if it was that. My new favorite phrase is constellation of factors. So if I have a challenge or a success, I like to make, it's usually a list because that's how we write things, but an unranked list of these are all the things that I think might have contributed to this, either challenge or success, in a constellation, not in a ranked list. Because I've been finding that my favorite reason for something, like, oh, well, that happened because we didn't get it weeded in time. 3 years later, as I think back, I start to realize there's more to it, and there's actually probably 3 or 4 things going on there. Record keeping also lets you see longer term patterns. So is this a challenge that just creamed us this year, like it's devastating, or only this year, or is it something that is kind of niggling and bugging at your success every single year? And that can help you decide where you're going to put your efforts. We can't always do everything. And so choosing where you're going to put your effort, that can be really, good records can really be kind of comforting and helping you decide, yes, I want to put my effort here because look, it's a problem every single year. Anticipate challenges, and this is where really important. We're in this talk trying to get ahead of these things and work on these challenges when they're the most easily addressed. And in order to do that, you have to anticipate at least some of these challenges. Also, don't borrow your troubles. We have some beautiful tunnel cucumbers in this picture. Tunnel cucumbers host many, many pests, insect pests, mite pests. One of them is whitefly, but on our farm, we never saw whitefly. We don't see whitefly yet on any crop. And so it's something I just don't worry about. And I just check that off my list. Never seen whitefly. Until we see it, I'm not going to worry about it. And then also, again, allows you to pick your battles. What are you going to focus on? Where are you going to put your effort? And what are you just going to skip? Well, maybe we're just not going to fight that battle. So, is it a challenge or is it a problem? I think timing makes all the difference. If you're early in the cycle or you're thinking ahead, it can be a challenge. But when you're in the middle of it, when that rampaging cow is already thundering down on you, then it's a problem. So weeds, pests, diseases, these are all challenges we all face all the time when we're growing. And they definitely can become huge problems, especially in that busy season when we are working as hard as we can. And if things get kind of out of control, it's very, very hard to have the time and effort needed to bring them back to a decent spot. All of these things are living things. Our crops are living things. We're living things. With living things, good identification is really critical in order to understand what your choices are in terms of taking action. So weeds. There's quite a lot to say about weeds. We farm on a large area, about 30 acres. And some of that area is actually in the floodplain. Some farms are going to really focus on preventing any seeds from getting back into their soil. We have found that that is not a realistic strategy for us yet. Although we do aim for that, we have to give ourselves a lot of grace, because even were we to keep this field clean of every weed, once every 2 to 3 years in the winter and once every 10 years in the growing season, we are going to have a flood that brings in a whole bunch of weed seeds. So preventing seeds on weeds would be the first place where you can prevent weeds from getting hold. But it's not the only place you can take action. And while it's nice, it sometimes is just really hard to be practical day to day. So I do know, and we're actually excited to start trying this, preventing seeds, tarps. If you're on a smaller growing area, or even you have part of your farm which you're managing kind of in the smaller scale space, a tarp can be a really good way where when you're not using that space, even if you have, half an hour to get that tarp laid out and weighed down, you've just put pause on that area. So if there are no weeds yet, you can put that tarp over, you've paused everything, and hopefully when you come back to it, there still won't be any weeds. Or even if there are just a few weeds, there'll still be just a few, hopefully dead weeds, rather than a jungle of weeds. So on smaller plots, tarps, I think, are really, really interesting. So the second thing we might consider is killing the weeds in the soil. And this is all before your crop is even there. And so solarization is one way of doing that. And that's usually saturating your soil with water, putting clear plastic over the top on a bright sunny day, hopefully several bright sunny days, and actually baking that top inch of soil to kill those weed seeds. Other ways we kill weed seeds in soil, though, are just cultivating, hoeing, working that top inch of soil. And I keep referencing the top inch because this is the layer of soil where weed seeds usually germinate. So if a weed seed is deeper than 1 inch, it usually won't germinate. It'll just hang out down there and not do anything. And so it's those in the top inch that usually germinate. So if you can kind of think about it as cleaning that top inch, then what you created is an inch of mulch, soil mulch, over your surface. This is also a consideration when we're cultivating. So maybe we do have a crop in the ground. As we cultivate, We want to, as much as possible, only disturb that top inch, only stir that top inch, because if we dig deeper, if we dig down to 2 inches or 3 inches, then what we're doing is we might be stirring up weeds from those deeper layers, seeds, and then they're up on the top and they go, oh yeah, great, germinate. So as much as possible, we try to stick to the top inch, and then we go deeper when we have a compelling reason. So stale bedding, again, is a practice that can be used before the seeds are in the ground to reduce weed pressure. And so what this would be preparing your beds ahead of time, maybe 3 weeks if you really want serious stale bedding. And then oftentimes you want to try to get those weeds to germinate. So almost just like you're germinating a crop. If you can, you want to make a nice firm bed so all those weed seeds have really good soil contact and are really ready to germinate, and then irrigate so that they have perfect germinating conditions and they'll all germinate super fast. Then you can go through either mechanically or with a flame weeder and kill all those seeds you've just triggered. If you can do that a couple times over a couple weeks, you can get, again, like 95% or more of all those weed seeds in that top inch. Then once you've done that, the trick is just don't stir up anything that's laying down below. So stale bedding for us is critical on carrots, those tiny seeded, very kind of wimpy, non-competitive seedlings. If we can do good stale bedding, we can grow carrots. If something goes wrong in our stale bedding process, at this point, we don't even plant carrots. We just say that is not a battle we can fight. We'll try again next time.
Jenny, real quick, we do have some questions pouring in.
Great.
Would you prefer that to be held to the end or ask along the way?
Yeah, let's do a few questions.
All right, so one of the first ones was actually, how do you deal with squash borers and powdery mildew on your zucchinis?
Yes, let's, if we want to, maybe we can stick with some weed questions and then we'll squeeze those in a bit later with the pests and diseases. That might help.
All right, that's a good point. So wiregrass and chickweed were two topics that people were curious about. What do you have to say about those?
Oh boy. Yeah, wiregrass is a really tough one. Those grasses are really tough. Yeah, unfortunately on those grasses, tarping might be helpful over a long period of time, like years, but you have to somehow create a root barrier around the edges so that your wiregrasses that are kind of outside your plot can't just reach their roots under and feed those roots underneath, even while you're trying to starve them by covering them with a dark tarp. Unfortunately, the other like broad tool that we use, if we have a really bad patch, we're just going to do a bare fallow where we're tilling it and leaving it bare repeatedly over a summer or a summer and fall, just to try to chop up those roots, those grass roots, and then starve them repeatedly. Every time they try to resprout, we just beat them back again. That is like a hard reset. Once we've done that, we might be able to keep them down with really faithful hand weeding, like every 3 weeks. So we have to get them beat back to a point where there's few, and then hopefully we can zip through our space with a half an hour or an hour of time every 3 weeks or so. But you still got to consider your edges. They can definitely creep in from the edges. Chickweed is really interesting. Chickweed germinates at certain times of year. All weeds germinate at certain times of year, and you might see that maybe in the spring you get your plots all weeded from your early seeded green beans, and then suddenly all these new weeds are sprouting. I'm like, wait, I weeded my top inch of soil. I had this clean, and that's just because you weeded all the spring weeds out, but now the summer weeds, June, the summer weeds are saying, oh, now's our time to germinate and go. So chickweed, we found really interestingly a tillage or a disturbance preventing germination actually in August, in early September for us, and we're in South Central Pennsylvania, can really limit the chickweed pressure through the winter and then into the next spring. So our problematic chickweed is actually germinating in the fall and then it hangs out all winter. And it's a problem next spring because chickweed's one of those ones you can till, you can disturb, you can rip out most of the plant by hand, and that little tiny piece remains or falls off and it will drop roots and just keep on trucking. So our favorite, if we have a field that's really, really bad in chickweed, our favorite right now is to till and seed tillage radish actually in August, using irrigation to get really good germination on that tillage radish if it's really dry. And then tillage radish does great stuff for the soil, but also shades out and smothers the chickweed and then vanishes through the winter so that come spring, we have the cleanest spring field that I have ever seen. So that's our favorite for chickweed.
That's great. I actually took notes on that myself. Generally, I burn my fields, and if I get chickweed, I actually collect all of it, dry it, and then we sell it as it's kind of a natural remedy for allergies in the springtime. So if you can monetize on that, work with nature. So we had actually a question about yellow nutsedge. How do you deal with yellow nutsedge as well?
Yes, this is one that we don't have a lot of experience with, and I'm very thankful for that. So maybe if other folks have experience with yellow nutsedge and techniques that they've found helpful, maybe type those in the chat. Or if you're really up for it, give your name and this person can reach out to you. Because that's one that thankfully we have not had to battle yet.
Yeah, I think that was the last of our, because I had actually never heard of yellow nutsedge either. I don't have a problem on my farm. The rest are living pests, but we did have a couple questions about flooding. How do you deal with flooding in your farm life?
Yeah, super big challenge for us because like this field you see in this picture, this September 1st was probably under 4 feet of fast moving water. And so we did lose soil. Besides we lost some crop, we also lost an inch or more of soil. And so that's really devastating long-term, and we cannot afford to do that, especially as these floods will probably become more and more likely. So we have to be proactive. There's nothing we can do the day before a hurricane hits. And our current thought and strategy is just keep as many roots in the ground as much of the time as possible. So we have been doing interplanting, sowing, trying clover under sweet corn, clover under brassicas, but clover, while it's beautiful, is not a big enough root mass quickly enough to hold our soil in September if we get a flood. So we're really looking at lots of different options, but basically it's how can we overlap our crops with our cover crops with our crops so that there's always roots holding that soil in place. Yeah, and another thing that we implemented a few years ago was crop-wise and field-wise. I don't plant anything in the bottoms for harvest after August 30th. So they're really only used in the summer when the risk is lower. And when we do get to August 30th, hopefully as little ground is kind of open and unprotected as we can manage, because we've finished harvesting. It's just the tail end of whatever we were working on. Great, thank you. Good questions.
Let me know when you're ready to move on to live pests.
Yes, great. So just a couple other things. Weed barriers, so like a tarp. A tarp would be a weed barrier, but we do use black plastic, agricultural plastic. We use white plastic. And again, we're just removing a problem before it's a problem by putting this solid barrier down on much of our growing surface before there's a problem there at all. Now, we do make holes though. We make holes in our plastic to plant our plants. And that's where we actually will mulch those holes as soon as possible. As soon as that little transplant is tall enough that we can plop down a handful of mushroom soil on that hole, we do. And we make sure that our mushroom soil mulch is at least an inch thick. So we know our mushroom soil is clean soil, no weed seeds, we hope. And so if we can put at least an inch thick, just plop it over that hole, then we know that all the weeds down in the soil under that hole are deeper than an inch and probably won't germinate. So this is great for tomatoes, okra, our longer season crops that we do in plastic. We transplant them, and as soon as we transplant them, we're putting it on the plan to get some mulch over those holes as soon as those plants are tall enough, which is about 6 inches. We also, when we used to grow onions, we made sure to mulch our onion sets. So we'd plant our onion sets in April, put lots of holes in that black plastic, and then we'd go through just a couple weeks later. If we needed to, we'd just smear any little tiny weeds across the surface of the soil, kill them, and mulch all those holes. It saves so much time. Again, timing can make all the difference. Everything I've been talking about here, I'm thinking about the seeds or the just germinated seeds underneath the soil surface or just emerged weeds. We want to get them when they're the most vulnerable, they're the weakest, they're just starting out. So 3 examples. We have winter squash, green beans, beets, and carrots. So winter squash for us, we transplant all of our winter squash bare ground. And we really love the tine weeder for bare ground. And we use it on winter squash as well as green beans. So what we do is we transplant the winter squash into well-prepared, probably slightly stale bedded soil. And then as soon as those little squash transplants start to root out into the soil, so maybe 4 to 5 days later, we're going right over them with the tine weeder and working the whole surface of the bed, right over little squashes. You do have to go kind of slow so you don't break their stems. But the tine weeder works on weeds that you can't see yet. The weeds that have germinated and are white threads in the soil. You might see a few kind of emerging on the surface with their tiny little first leaves. You won't necessarily kill all the ones you see, but if you can have a nice dry day and you can rake over it with the tine weeder once, you can separate those little thread stage weeds from the soil. They'll dry out and die, and that's fantastic. And you're doing the whole surface of the bed. So our favorite tool, we would do that about 3 times over 10 to 12 days. And then we switch to something we call squash knives, which are blades that will then reach under the now quite large squash plants. And we're still just working the first ½ inch of the soil. Maybe for another 3 passes, 10 days if we're lucky. By that time, the squash is vined out. And we just let it go. You might do a quick hand weeding at this patch or that patch, but unless the weather really is uncooperative and just stays super wet that whole time, that's 99% of our squash weed control. One of the reasons the big reason we transplant our winter squash is what we're doing is we're putting out a plant that's 3 weeks ahead of any weeds that might be its neighbors. So we have to create that difference, that gap between the size of the crop and the size of, or the strength of the weeds. And in order to use our mechanical tools, whether those are hand tools or tools on a tractor, you need that difference in size. If they're the same size, if your crop and your weeds are the same size, basically you've got a hand weed, because that's when we have to make the decisions of, oh, this thing, not that thing. Green beans, it's very similar for us. Do we direct seed a lot of green beans? We do transplant some in the very early spring. And again, that tine weeder is the first thing we use, and we'll actually tine weed before the beans emerge. Same for sweet corn. So we plant the green beans, irrigate them, we'll watch them very closely, digging up seeds. And as soon as they have their root going down 1 inch, they put a root down first, and then they start to put a sprout up. As soon as they've got that little tail anchoring them in the ground, we cultivate with the tine weeder. That might be, again, like 5 days after seeding. Then beans have this period where they're coming up out of the ground and they're hook shaped. They come up and then they straighten up. When they're in that hook stage, we can't tine weed because the tine weeder will catch all the hooks and pop them right out of the ground. So what we do is we have to wait, and as soon as they straighten up, we tine weed again. Again, about 3 passes with a tine weeder will do 95% of your weeds if the weather cooperates and you can do everything on time.
So Jennifer, we had a question. Are you planting bush beans or pole beans?
We are doing bush beans. But if you did pole beans and you had, Johnny's sells them, they have this really cool, it's basically a hand tine weeder. It's a special rake. And if you did, we're doing pole beans along a trellis or along a structure, you could use that basically specialized rake in exactly the same way. So beets and carrots I talked about a little bit already, a bit more preparation because we have smaller seeds, smaller, weaker seedlings, longer time when they're vulnerable. So we do a really good stale bedding. And then what we do is we actually plant the carrots and beets, and then we will flame them right before those carrots and beets emerge. So we plant the crop seed, irrigate everything. Hopefully any lingering weeds pop up. We see their leaves are above the soil. And we're watching to see just before those carrots or beets pop out of the soil, come above the soil surface, we will run over with the flamer. And I actually might have another picture of this. There it is. Flamer's on top there. And again, set all those weeds back. So now the crop, which is going to pop out of the soil tomorrow, will be the biggest thing around. So for beets and carrots, flamer is key. Again, weather has to cooperate. If it's too wet, it doesn't work very well. Once we get our beets and carrots out of the ground, ahead of all the weeds, then we go to our basket weeder, which just scuffs the surface of the soil very gently. Doesn't turn any soil over, just keeps things dry. Again, this is harder because it's harder to keep a gap between a small crop seedling and fast growing weeds. Great. Okay, so let's get into diseases and pests. So this, maybe you've seen it before, maybe you haven't, but there's this mental model of having a problem from a pest or disease. You need 3 things. You need a susceptible host. You need the presence of the pest or the disease, and then you also need a favorable environment. So when we have challenges or we anticipate challenges, we can work ahead of time to manage any of these points or sides on a triangle in order to prevent or minimize the problem. So for us, cucurbit downy mildew is a major challenge of the last 10 or 12 years. Before that, we had lots and lots of resistant varieties. So we did not have susceptible hosts. Therefore, we did not have problems. And that was because our varieties had all had resistance bred into them. Then the disease overcame the resistance. And we're just starting to have some really great new varieties, which have new resistance to the new kind of disease variant. So we went from no susceptible hosts to all of our crops were susceptible, big problems. And then now we're getting, so we can actually just have resilient hosts again. And so no problem. Aphids are a really good example of something that environment makes a huge difference. So aphids are typically a problem of winter, spring, and fall. And that's because they have a microbe that they depend on in their gut that's very sensitive to temperature. Above about 75 degrees, that microbe cannot function, and the aphids will starve to death. So most aphids are really active and vibrant in the cooler weather. And in the heat, super hot, they're just not around. And if they're around, they're just hanging on by a thread. Except for the cabbage aphid, which thrives in hot and dry. But either way, if you can manage that environment or be aware of when you have a favorable environment, you have a better chance of being aware of when aphids might be a challenge. So pests. Every farm is unique. I mentioned before, we don't see whitefly on our farm yet. But neighboring farmers, if you have farm neighbors, it can be really fun and comforting to share some of the pests that you're struggling with if you have the same pests. If you don't have the same pests, that can be really interesting discussion. Correct identification is absolutely critical, and you probably want some help with this. Whether you reach out to Extension or super experienced neighbors, correct identification is absolutely key to understanding the life cycle. If you don't have good identification, you won't be getting good life cycle information. One of the reasons you want to understand the life cycle is so you can understand where to put your effort. Where in this life cycle is this pest most vulnerable? And what are all the points in the life cycle that you can try to disrupt? Skip the risk. Sometimes we choose just to not do it because it's just too much of a problem. Right now, we are skipping the risk. Well, deer are one of our biggest pests right now that seem to be going for everything. So I do not plant our late broccoli anymore because the deer pressure is just sky high in November, December, and I just want to skip that risk. Exclude is really great if you can do it ahead of time. We use this on a bok choy. We do spring bok choy, but we know that to be successful with bok choy and flea beetles, we have lots of flea beetles, we have to exclude those flea beetles right away. So we grow bok choy transplants, we transplant them, and as soon as those are in the ground, we cover them really tightly with row cover. So we just keep those flea beetles away. We grow gorgeous bok choy, but that would not be possible if we didn't exclude those flea beetles literally in the first hour of transplant. We also exclude allium leaf miner. We have allium leaf miner, and garlic is our only allium we grow right now. And so what we do is we monitor the flight of the adults when they're moving around, and we make sure we have row cover over our whole garlic field before that gets started. The flight for us is probably from late March all the way through June 1st. And so it's a long time. The garlic seems to tolerate it okay. It does get beat up if we have lots of high winds. The row cover will beat on the garlic a little more. But we've managed to keep allium leaf miner out of our garlic and still have really good storage garlic. So trapping, we don't use trap crops extensively, but some folks might. One of the examples here would be winter squashes. Striped or spotted cucumber beetles love blue Hubbard. If you have blue Hubbard transplants, they will go for blue Hubbard. It's just an absolute favorite. They'll go for those and leave some of your others alone. So you might be able to plant or have extra tasty, attractive blue Hubbard squash, and they'll leave your other squashes alone a little bit. To really do a good job trapping though, you need a second step. You need some way of killing or stopping them over there so they don't just make lots of babies on the blue Hubbard, and then you have a bigger problem next year. So not quite sure how you'd do that organically. because one of the reasons striped cucumber beetles are so tough is because they are a large, hard-bodied insect, tough to kill with one little spray of a material. We also want to remember fertility. So we can exclude the pest, but we also want to understand what to include. We could include biocontrols, include controls on that pest, just to keep them at a low level. We also want to include fertility. So sometimes if our plants are struggling to get what they need, they may be a more susceptible host. Whereas if we can get them everything they need, they will be a less susceptible host, and therefore you may have less of a problem. So biocontrols, we really have fun with these. It could be anything from microbes all the way up to livestock guardian dogs if you have deer or predator problems. But you have to be ahead of the pest. And that's where you have to get your control out there ahead of time. And it can be often kind of weeks or even months ahead of any problem that you're used to seeing. So on tunnel cucumbers, when we would seed our tunnel cucumbers in the greenhouse to grow the transplants, I would call and order the biocontrols right then for when we would transplant them 3 or 4 weeks later. And we keep those biocontrols with those plants right from the beginning. Fertility, it's same way. It's basically impossible to rescue a poor fertility situation. So you really want to stay ahead. We found that boron, getting enough boron to Brussels sprouts especially, but other brassicas, cauliflower, broccoli, kale too, really seems to help minimize the aphid pressure. And it's not clear why that would be exactly, but it seems to be a good thing. Again, we have to have that boron around throughout the growing cycle of the plant. You can also over fertilize. So onions, if you over fertilize your onions, too much nitrogen especially, you will definitely likely see more rot, poor storage in those onions. There's a sweet spot on onion utility to get that nice big succulent onion, but not encourage rot in your storage onions. So disease, again, every farmer is unique. The diseases you see may not be the diseases I generally see, though I think as we have more and more organic seed available, which I think is really great and important, I think we are going to see more and more of the same diseases because some of them are coming in on the seed. Correct identification is essential. And basically this means you have to get help. You have to send it somewhere to get it tested. There are very few things that can be identified even by an expert just by looking at them. And going back to that constellation of factors, this fall I sent a sample of broccoli because I was pretty sure it had black rot, and it did, but they also were able to tell me it had alternaria, which is an important factor for me to keep in my record. So sometimes you can help find out that, oh, it's more than one thing going on. There's other things going on too. Again, good understanding of life cycle. Does this disease need a living host, like late blight? If you have dead host, if you cut off your tomato plant at the base, it's now dead and you won't be growing more late blight on that dead tomato debris. Or does it just need that host? So black rot is one where it doesn't matter if it's living broccoli tissue or dead broccoli tissue. If there's broccoli tissue there, black rot can be living very happily. Skip the risk. This is one we use a lot and think about a lot for disease especially. We really rely on resistant varieties here. Then we also really think carefully about timing of plantings. So when cucurbit downy mildew became a big problem we pulled all of our winter squash plantings forward by a full month to try to get as much growth and as much winter squash grown before we were likely to have cucurbit downy mildew hitting us in August. Exclude, heat treating of seeds. This is a big one for us that we took the plunge on 5 or 6 years ago and has really helped. Not 100%, but definitely significantly. I feel like it's one of the few things I'm ever going to see in my farming career where I'm like, yes, this absolutely made a difference. If I'm not bringing those diseases in on the seed, then, or if I'm just bringing in a tiny bit rather than quite a bit, then we have a really good chance. We want to include also, again, include fertility, include the good guys, inoculation, whether that's in your potting mix. We're all trying to have just a really healthy, vibrant soil. That's also inoculation. Keep the good guys around, taking up the space, doing their good things. I touched on it already a little bit. Basil and basil downy mildew is another one. When we didn't have a resistant variety to the basil downy mildew, we were really just done on basil. We would plant our basil downy mildew would blow up the coast. We'd be done for the season. Now we have some good resistant varieties, and we can keep going right through September again with those. Okay, so hot water seed treatment. Take my time here. Some of you may have heard of this before, others may have not. This is tiny print, but these are all sorts of diseases that can come in inside your vegetable seeds. So for me, when I'd heard about hot water seed treatment, and I saw this list and I was like, whoa, this is more than just late blight and bacterial diseases on tomatoes, which are important, and black rot on cucurbits. There's a lot of other things here that we struggle with. So for the crucifers, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, black rot was a huge concern because we were seeing it come in on seed. We really don't want it in our soils. It's a big challenge, and it's systemic. So once it's there, we have almost nothing we can do about it. So black rot is really scary, but it's actually the Alternaria leaf spot, the first one on that list, that is a problem for us every single year. Black rot is this like scary, oh no, when it gets here, it's going to be really bad. But we were tolerating Alternaria and struggling against it every single year. And tomatoes are the other big one for us, that there's these bacterial diseases, bacterial spot, bacterial speck, bacterial canker, that have blemishes on your fruit, reduced storage times, that we had every single year. And so we took the plunge. We actually bought 2 digital hot water baths. It was about $800. And we, the time to carefully treat these seeds for various crops. And I really think for us, it definitely has been worth it. We've seen huge improvement on our tomato harvest quality. We've done lots of other things during that time to improve our tomato growing. But we have very few spotty tomatoes now, whereas before we were throwing away many, many spotty tomatoes. And then the Alternaria leaf spot, we had some this year that was a challenge, especially in some cabbage that was in one of our toughest fields to grow in. It was just really miserable cabbage, and the Alternaria got going. But almost immediately, Alternaria went from being one of our top concerns on our Brassicas to being an occasional thing that we saw now and then. There's some Alternaria. No worry. So hot water seed treatment works on seed-borne diseases. These are diseases that are actually down inside the seed, and oftentimes either under the seed coat or right next to the germ of the seed. So the equipment you need, I have some really good links here from the extension folks on how precisely the system works and what you need and variations, how you can save a little money and use a sous vide, which is a cooking equipment, for instead of getting all of the digital stuff. But equipment, you need 2 hot water baths that are very carefully temperature controlled. What you're trying to do with this is heat the seeds up warm enough, kind of like pasteurization, that we kill the pest, kill the disease, but it's just below the temperature where you might kill the seed, because we need that seed to survive. So you want very good temperature control, very precise. It's not going to go wonky without you noticing. Your first bath is going to warm the seeds, bring them up to about 100 degrees. And then your second bath is actually going to do the treatment, take them up a little bit higher than that and hold it for a specific amount of time. Each crop with different size seeds and different tolerances to temperature has a specific protocol that's been developed. And the extension folks have a list. It'll be like 22 minutes at 113 degrees Fahrenheit for whichever one that is. So we found this, it really benefited us on tomatoes and brassicas, but we've also used it on a variety of other things. We just go back to that list that I shared and see, oh, look, like Cercospora is giving a lot of trouble on beets. What if we heat treated our beet? We put the most effort into our hand transplanted beets in the spring. Let's see if that makes a difference for us. There are trade-offs. You can get reduced germination. When we heat treat, we tend to plant 20% more seed to make sure you get enough transplants. So far, we think the trade-offs are worth it. Another trade-off is if a seed company has already heat treated the seed because they're testing for disease. If they find disease and they heat treat to remove as much of that disease as possible, and then you heat treat again, then you're probably really going to reduce germination. And it can be tricky to find out from them if they've heat treated, because they don't really want to advertise that they know that this seed is contaminated with a disease. But on organic seed, I think we're going to have to get used to having some disease in our seed production if we expect organic seeds, because these diseases are down inside the plants, and that's not something that organic materials can clean up. So anyways, if you were to do 2 heat treatments, the seed company did one and then you did another one, you would see reduced germination almost certainly. You also do need really fresh seed. If you have old seed, it's already kind of weak, it's lost some of its vigor just from storage, and you heat treat it, then you're going to see reduced germination. And it's important to remember, this is not going to be a 100% foolproof. Now I have no black rot in my broccoli seeds, but we've seen a huge improvement. An example is this year we had some black rot come through on our Brussels sprouts, but we still had probably the 3rd best Brussels sprout year in the last 10 to 15 years. And we saw the black rot out there. We're like, oh, what's that? What's going on? We got it tested, but it wasn't affecting young plants. It showed up really as a problem really late in the growing season, and we still got lots of great Brussels sprouts. Now we are going to keep careful records and not plant any brassicas in that field for at least 3 years, hopefully longer, to minimize chance of the next crop having a problem. But I think, I don't know, we're not an experimental farm, but I think without heat treatment, we probably would have had a big Brussels sprout problem.
Hey, Jenny, quick time check. We're just after 10 o'clock at 10:01, so we got about 14 minutes left.
Okay.
So there are some other questions, but if you want to, depends on how you want to navigate the rest.
Okay, great. I think I have just a couple more slides here and then questions would be fantastic. So fertility and disease, again, this is like, what do we want to include to minimize disease? You can think about it as creating the most resilient host. If you don't have that susceptible host, you might have less disease problem. Again, boron and Brussels sprouts, boron was just a key for us. It was the game changer. When we figured out that our soils were deficient in boron and that we could supply it at just the right amounts, both ahead of planting and during the growing season, we saw a really big improvement in our Brussels sprouts specifically, but our other brassicas as well. I already mentioned the nitrogen and onions. If you do too much nitrogen in onions, you're going to have diseases, especially like bacterial soft rots, more in your storage onions. If you have too little, you're going to have weak onions that may be more susceptible to onion downy mildew or thrips even. So there's a sweet spot on onions for just the right fertility. And nutritional deficiencies can just be lost yields, and it can be hard to see. Your plant can look really good, but it might just not set as many fruit as it could, or the quality of that fruit may be compromised. And then also it can be more susceptible to diseases. So just a couple important practices: scouting and observing ahead of time. Timing is everything. So when I scout for weeds, I always ask myself, what does it look like now? Okay, let's imagine, what is it going to look like next week? So if I have a weed that's an inch tall now and we're in the summertime, that weed's probably going to be 4 inches tall next week. And then what do I want to do about that? Correct identification is critical. Life cycles can be really helpful in understanding where you can take action. Recording your observations so that you can remind yourself of this story again next year and see if it's the same story or a different story. And use your human resources. So this might be extension agents, definitely fellow farmers, and anyone else who is a good resource for you. Definitely, this is an area where it can be really, really helpful. And at the end of the day, some of these things will still be beyond our control. And it is a really good practice to be able to make that decision of just like, look, this is out of my control. I just gotta let it go, but I'm gonna put my energy and effort into this other thing. And that's a choice I'm making, and that is a good choice. Right, and I think that's all I have for slides. What do we have for questions?
All right, so I've written quite a few of them down. I feel like we have a lot about different diseases, but recently there was one question that said, can you use dilute bleach for seed treatment, or can you use a temperature controlled induction cooktop with hot water for a hot water treatment? Would you mind fielding those first?
Sure. So bleach, anything like bleach or sanidate, that might do the outside surface, but the challenge with these is these diseases are actually inside the seed. So underneath the seed coat, or even right up against the germ of the seed, that living heart of the seed that's actually going to grow your plant. So while that can be helpful for surface diseases, and there are some diseases that definitely are on the surface, this gets hopefully down through the plant. And so a lot of these diseases are kind of get into the seed even at the flowering stage of the seed production. So there's a flower, the disease is present, it kind of gets into that flower when that seed is being formed. And then you have a mature seed that comes to you, or that you have. And so then the question is, how do you get that disease out from the inside of that seed? What was the second part of that question?
So can you use an induction, temperature controlled induction cooktop?
Yes, it won't be precise enough. You really need it precise to the degree. And so that while folks do that, for some folks, you see pictures of the pot on top of the stove with a very good thermometer, hopefully, that's much riskier. And you can very quickly lose many plantings of seeds that way. So
It's a random thought, but what about those? I'm probably going to mispronounce this because I am not a chef, but I think it's called sous vide.
yes,
Would those
those are
work?
useful for the first step, for the first heating, like getting things warm and ready to go. Those are a really great way to save money on that first hot water bath. But for the second one, again, you want something that's really precise. Now, the extension services in Pennsylvania, anyways, they have this equipment and they take it around in the spring, and you can go and meet it and use it. Massachusetts actually has a service where I think you just send them your seeds and they do it for you. And I'm not sure if Maryland, I'm just not familiar with Maryland and what might be available, but there are resources around. Also, if you have a farmer neighbor, like if you're close to us and you want to bring your seeds and do a heat treatment, let us know. We have farmer neighbors who come and use our equipment, and that's really great. You could have a heat treating party.
That is great. I know that a lot of the farmers around here and we share resources all the time. Collaboration is way more powerful than competition. Yes. So we actually had a question. There's so many, and I know we're running short on time. So there was a couple of people asking about aphids, and one in particular, there was in general, and then one in particular was, how do you control aphids in a greenhouse?
Yes, so aphids in the greenhouse. It depends on a lot of things, but I can speak to, we grow mixed vegetable transplants in our greenhouse starting in about February. We do turn on the heat, and it starts right then. So what we actually do is we use a system called banker plants. So disclaimer, my mother owns IPM Laboratories up in Lock, New York, Carol Glenister, and she developed this system where we grow a barley to grow an aphid that only likes grasses, so only likes that barley. This aphid is not going to go off and get on the tomatoes. That aphid then will grow a parasitoid wasp, a little tiny wasp. So we're growing this little ecosystem to grow these little wasps that then fly all over our greenhouse at their leisure, hunting down aphids that they want to then lay their eggs in and kill. This is our first line of defense. We also make sure that there's no weeds growing in our greenhouse, no little reservoirs for aphids to hang out on. But we still have to scout, because the wasps that we get only like a few kinds of aphids. And so if we get another kind of aphid in here that they don't like, we need to see that so we can take action. If we had something else come in and we're like, ooh, this is maybe going in a direction we don't like, ladybugs used to be a really great option. Unfortunately, with the fires in the West and the droughts, the ladybugs are just not available anymore because they were always wild harvested out of the West. So this winter we're using, what's it called? Lacewing larvae are voracious aphid predators. There's also really cool natural enemies that you can try to host in your greenhouse, although it can be hard to get them to come in. Hoverflies, they need a pollen source, so they need maybe some blooming sweet alyssum. And then you can also get a little midge. It's called a Phytolides, where you release it and the adults lay their eggs. You don't see them, and then you see these little tiny orange, and they're actually maggots, like little tiny orange fly maggots crawling around your plants. And they are also voracious aphid predators.
That is fascinating. I love that. I have released samurai wasps and lacewings into my greenhouse here, but I bought them. The barley, that's really neat. That is very neat. Thelonious, how are we looking on time here? Can we ask some more questions?
Yeah, we got about 4 minutes exactly. So
Okay, all right. Let me
two more questions.
So this one's actually on boron. How often do brassicas need boron?
Right. Okay. So first, we do a soil test, usually soil test in the fall, and we watch those boron levels really closely. So boron is deficient in our soils. Our soils do not have boron. It's all weathered away because we have highly weathered soils. And so boron is also soluble, which means that even though we put some in, and it's just the tiniest little bit, it's like, 1 pound per entire acre of a field. Even though we put some in, and if it stayed there, it'd be enough for years, the rain is just going to slowly leach it out. So soil test, and then we put down a base amount. It's usually 1 to 3 pounds before planting. We use our crop sprayer to do that. We put it out in the water. And then I would usually spray boron with our imported cabbage worm spray. I'm spraying BT. I'm scouting very carefully and choosing a spray window when the imported cabbage worms are just hatching. I usually throw, usually it's 1/4 to 1/2 pound per acre of boron, solubor, into that spray. Maybe twice, at most 3 times, because you can overdo it. This is a micronutrient. You can definitely overdo it. And strawberries and green beans are most sensitive to boron. So don't overdo it on those. But brassicas really seem to love it and thrive with it. So I would say 2 times. Once when the plants are, young teenagers, and probably once when the plants are almost full size, thinking about making their edible parts.
Great. Can we squeeze in a question about how
One
you
more
deal
quick
with...
question. Yep.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
Polonius. There's so many good ones.
Yeah. Oh no, I was saying, yeah.
Oh, I thought you were gonna ask questions. Okay, so can we squeeze in a question about harlequin beetles and how you deal with those?
Oh, this is a really good one. And again, we don't have this problem yet. We see them present, but maybe there can be a harlequin chat room later on. If anyone wants to join that. Not my area of expertise yet. We're still at the point where if we see the damage, the little snowflake damage on a plant, we stop right then, and we hunt all the neighboring plants and we squish them all we can find. And there might be 2 spots in the entire field that we can find a plant with harlequin bug beetles on it. So you guys are ahead of me on that challenge.
Yeah, there's many other sessions. You can ask that question later on, including the vegetable grower session. Well, that concludes our time, and I want to thank you so much, Jenny. I've definitely enjoyed listening and learning from you. If you guys want to rehear or re-listen to this talk, it is available the same way that you guys arrived here. You can re-listen. You can also download Jenny's PowerPoint. I've also included a link to her website and Instagram. Now we have about 15 minutes before the next session starts, which is an official welcome from our executive director, Dina Libman, followed by our keynote talk from Renard Turner. So you definitely, if you've never heard Renard talk, you definitely want to hear that. So we're right on time. So see you guys in the next one.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was wonderful.
You're welcome.